Welcome back, debaters. You know, I can always tell when a debater has transcended confusion and entered the world of understanding debate. It's the moment when the debater asks me what is supposed to happen in rebuttals. That moment is important in a debater's career because it signifies an understanding that rebuttals are a critical part of debate, and they are. On the surface, the rebuttals give each debater 5 minutes to crystallize his or her arguments and weigh them against the arguments of the opposing team. But beneath the surface is a complex world of strategy, time management, and decision making. So let's get started and explore rebuttal strategies. And in order to talk about rebuttals, we need to remind ourselves of what just happened in the Constructives. You see, the four debaters have just spent the last 32 minutes bombarding the judge with arguments, and it doesn't matter whether the judge is highly experienced or has no experience. He or she has been trying to track, juggle, and remember both sets of arguments from both teams. And in a world where debaters talk really fast or rarely take the time to transition smoothly from one argument to the next, jumping rapidly between arguments can often be confusing for even the most experienced judge. Moreover, the Constructives tend to contain a whole lot of evidence and not a lot of analysis, so judges are often forced to absorb all those arguments without a lot of context. So your first goal in a rebuttal is to help the judge understand all of your arguments. He or she might not have processed all the minor nuances, pithy details, and or abstract links between your subpoints. So you'll need your rebuttal time to smooth out those rough spots and paint a crystal clear picture for your judge. You can think of it like this. If you were a pilot and the judge was your passenger, your constructive is the 50-foot perspective, close enough to see the specific details like authors, dates, claims, warrants, taglines, and quick analyses. Your rebuttal needs to be the 50,000-foot perspective. It should be the big picture that lets your judge see everything all at once. The second goal is to weigh your arguments against your opponent's arguments. Keep in mind that both teams have probably just spent the first half of the round introducing argument after argument without spending a lot of time talking about how they all work together. More importantly, which arguments did you want the judge to evaluate first? What arguments presented by the opposing team should be evaluated last? What are the most important and the least important arguments? And why? If you think your topicality argument is a priority issue, you need to explain why the judge needs to decide topicality before anything else. If you think your terrorism disadvantage is far more likely to occur before the affirmative team's economy advantage, you need to explain why and how. And by doing so, you begin to tell a story. And that's the third goal of a rebuttal. It isn't a story with characters and a plot. Instead, your rebuttal is a story of what happens if the judge votes affirmative. The affirmative team will say that after the judge votes affirmative, life will get better. The negative team will say that if the judge votes affirmative, life will get much worse. In order to tell that story, you have to weave in all of your arguments together to form a sequence of events. First, the judge votes affirmative, and that sets forth a chain of events. Whether those events are good or bad depends on the team. But by framing the rebuttal as a story, first this happens, then this happens, you can tell the story of the affirmative, good or bad. The fourth goal of your rebuttal is to preempt your opponent's arguments. To preempt means to predict and respond to the arguments you think your opponents will make. After your first few tournaments, you'll start to get a good idea of what your opposition will say in response to your affirmative and negative arguments. By preempting in your constructives and in your rebuttals, you can either prevent those arguments from being made or you can answer them before they're even thought about. Preempting rebuttals is especially important because you'll soon be out of your speeches and you don't want your opponent to sneak in one last argument in his or her last speech that you can't respond to. That's not good debating, nor is it something you want to get in the habit of doing. The last goal of the rebuttal is to close your case and make your arguments convincing. You'll be able to leave the judge with the final most important details of your position before he or she decides the round. To plant these seeds, you need to boil down the round into a few major ideas that only last a sentence or two. By having a few different ideas, you give the judge several reasons to vote for you. But by boiling them down to a sentence or two, you make those reasons crystal clear. Now let's switch gears and talk about a strategy used by advanced debaters in almost every round, kicking arguments in rebuttals. Now by now you might have seen a few of the advanced debaters and watched them have a practice debate. You might have noticed that they presented 5 or 6 shells in the 1NC, but by the time they got to the rebuttals, they only have 2 or 3 arguments. This is strategically smart for a few reasons. First, as long as you do it correctly, judges won't punish you for kicking arguments. Let's say I told you that your school board was considering school uniforms for next year. You might list 5 reasons why school uniforms are a bad idea. And in order to win the debate, you don't have to win all 5 arguments, you just need to win 1. Similarly, in a debate round, good negative teams will offer lots of arguments in the 1NC, but they'll only discuss the ones that they're winning in the rebuttals. Remember that kicking arguments is strategic, and you must kick them carefully. If you just stop talking about them, the other team or the judge might think that you accidentally dropped them. If that happens, judges might vote against you if they think you mismanaged the round. So kick arguments, don't drop them. Which arguments do you kick in the negative rebuttals? Well, that depends on what you're winning in the negative block. If you are really confident that you're winning a big, huge, important argument, you should probably continue making a big deal of that argument in your final speeches. But sometimes the arguments that we win on aren't the big arguments. Sometimes you can win on very small arguments. Here's an example. Let's say that you make a very quick defensive argument about their solvency evidence. Perhaps the evidence didn't mention that their plan does this, that, or the other thing. It only vaguely mentions the topic. The argument itself maybe took 10 seconds to make way back in the 1NC. You mentioned it again in the first negative rebuttal, but you really didn't hear a response in the first affirmative rebuttal. And although it was a tiny 10-second argument in the 1NC, maybe it's time to make a really big argument in the second negative rebuttal. I'm willing to bet good money that if you spend 2 minutes of your rebuttal talking about how the affirmative team can't win solvency because their evidence is insufficient and they haven't responded to your arguments, you could probably convince the judge to vote on that alone. So regardless of whether you're taking a really big, important argument or a really small one, your rebuttal should be used to explode the arguments that you believe that you are winning in the round. The last thing we'll do today is look at each of the 4 rebuttals to see how they are different. There are some common strategies that are unique to each rebuttal that you'll see develop over time. We'll start with the 1NR. As you already know, the negative block is comprised of 13 minutes of back-to-back negative speeches. So it's critical that you and your partner have a conversation about which arguments you will take in the 2NC and which arguments are in the 1NR. There's no perfect formula for which arguments go in which speech, but you should have a strategy that allows each of you to cover all of the arguments adequately. Remember that you will want to minimize your time on some arguments, such as the ones you're kicking, and you'll want to maximize your time on the arguments that you are winning. The 1AR is the most challenging speech because you must cover every argument in 5 minutes. That means you won't spend a lot of time on each argument. So the 1AR is not the time for getting on your soapbox and going on and on about any one argument. The 1AR should have a nearly perfect flow going into the rebuttals, and the arguments you need to make should be pre-written, concise, and clean. If, for example, they have 6 responses to that topicality argument, you might only have time for 3 or 4 responses, and you need to make them count. So group arguments whenever possible and be efficient in the 1AR. The last negative rebuttal is the 2NR. The entire purpose of this rebuttal is to isolate the negative arguments that matter most and weigh them against the remaining affirmative arguments. Coming into the 2NR, you might still have a handful of active arguments that you consider viable. Maybe you go for all of them, or maybe you kick all but one of them. But whatever you do go for, you need to make strong and convincing. The last minute of the 2NR should encapsulate the entire round into a final message or a grand conclusion. It should be crystal clear and without any debate jargon. The last affirmative rebuttal is the 2AR. The 2AR is a time to defend against any and all remaining negative arguments and to promote the AF. This is often just a matter of weighing the negative impacts with the affirmative impacts. Once that's done, you'll want to use the last minute of the 2AR to paint a picture for the judge of what life is like after the judge votes affirmative. This last minute should not be jumbled with jargon or lightning fast. It should be deliberate, persuasive, and effective. So, that's it for rebuttals. As you continue debating, you'll learn that there is a whole world of strategy that will open up to you as you gain experience. But for now, that's what you need to know about rebuttals. So that's all for now. Good luck, debaters.